The year is 1191. A man is standing on a beach in the Middle East, staring at a walled city across the sand. He's sunburned, he's furious, and he has just sailed from England with the most feared army in Europe. His name is Richard. They call him the Lionheart. And somewhere behind those walls, commanding an empire that stretches from Egypt to Syria, is the one man on earth who can stop him. His name is Saladin. And when these two finally collide, the world will never be the same. This is not a story about who won. This is a story about two men so perfectly matched, so equally brilliant, so completely opposite, that history had no choice but to remember them both. Forever. Act 1. The World Before the Storm. To understand why this rivalry mattered, you need to understand just how broken the world was in the 12th century. The Middle East in the 1180s was a patchwork of competing kingdoms, shifting alliances, and ancient grudges held together by a thin, fragile thread of diplomacy. The Crusader states, those strange little Christian kingdoms carved out of the Holy Land nearly a century before, existed in permanent tension with the surrounding Muslim world. They traded with their neighbors, negotiated with them, occasionally intermarried with them. It was awkward. It was complicated. And for a while it more or less worked. Then came Raynald of Chatillon. Raynald was, to put it diplomatically, a catastrophic idiot with a sword. He was a Crusader prince stationed at a fortress called Carrick, and he had absolutely no interest in the peace treaty that everyone else had agreed to honor. In 1187 he did something that guaranteed a war. He attacked a Muslim caravan that was passing peacefully through the region, despite the fact that the caravan was protected by the truce. He stole their goods. He imprisoned their people. He reportedly kept Saladin's own sister among the captives. Saladin, a man who had spent years building the Muslim world into a unified political force through patience, strategy, and sheer force of personality, received the news with quiet fury. He had been waiting for an excuse. Raynald had just handed him a perfect one. Saladin mobilized his army. What came next was not a battle. It was a lesson. Act 2. The Trap at the Horns of Hattin. The year is 1187. July. The Galilee region. And it is absolutely brutally hot. Saladin's military genius was not the kind that relied on overwhelming numbers or brute force. It was the kind that understood human weakness, thirst, exhaustion, panic, and turned those things into weapons. He had studied the Crusader army. He knew they were heavily armored knights who depended on water. He knew the region. And he used both facts to build the perfect trap. He lured the Crusader army away from their water sources by threatening the city of Tiberias. The Crusaders, despite being warned by cooler heads not to march, took the bait. They marched out into the summer heat, heavily armored, carrying enormous amounts of equipment, moving across rocky terrain with no water anywhere near them. Saladin let them march. He let them get thirsty. He let them get desperate. He surrounded them with light cavalry that harassed them from all sides without ever fully engaging. He set fire to the dry grass around them so the smoke choked their lungs. By the time the Crusader army reached the Horns of Hattin, two rocky peaks that rose like horns from the earth, they were done. They couldn't fight. They could barely stand. Saladin's forces swarmed them, and in a single afternoon, the most powerful military force the Crusaders had assembled in a generation was destroyed. Raynald of Chatillon was captured. Saladin offered him a drink of water, a gesture of mercy by the customs of the time. Then, when Raynald refused to apologize for his crimes, Saladin personally executed him with his sword. Among the prizes seized from the battlefield was something that made the entire Christian world shudder: a fragment of the true cross. The actual cross, or rather, a piece of wood believed with absolute conviction to be from it, that the Crusaders had carried into battle as a divine talisman. It was gone. In Muslim hands. It was as if the symbol of Christianity itself had been taken prisoner. Weeks later, Saladin rode into Jerusalem. After nearly 90 years of Christian rule, the holy city fell in a matter of days. And here is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. Saladin did not massacre the population. He allowed Christians to leave safely, paid ransoms for the poor from his own treasury, and protected the city's holy sites. He was, by any 12th century standard, extraordinarily merciful. Back in Europe, the reaction was less measured. When Pope Gregory VIII heard the news, he issued the call for a Third Crusade. He described Hattin as God's punishment for the sins of the Crusaders. He demanded that the greatest kings of Christendom take up the cross and march east. 3 kings answered. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who then promptly drowned crossing a river in Anatolia, which is one of the more embarrassing exits from history. Philip II of France, clever and calculating, always more interested in politics than glory. And a young, recently crowned king of England named Richard, who had literally just fought a war against his own father to take the throne, and now immediately pointed himself at the Middle East like a very angry compass needle pointing toward war. Richard I of England, the Lionheart. 29 years old, 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5, built like a weapon and burning with ambition. He had been raised to fight. He had been fighting since he was 16. He spoke French better than English and spent almost no time in his actual kingdom, which tells you everything you need to know about his priorities. He wasn't going to Jerusalem because he was deeply religious. He was going because this was the greatest military challenge in the known world. And Richard did not walk away from challenges. Act 3. The Siege of Acre and the Arrival of Kings. By the time Richard arrived in the Holy Land in June of 1191, a siege had already been going on for nearly 2 years. The city of Acre, a port city on the Mediterranean coast, crucial for controlling supply lines in and out of the region, had been under Crusader siege since 1189. The situation was one of military history's stranger arrangements. The Crusaders were besieging the city and Saladin was besieging the Crusaders. A double siege. Like two snakes trying to eat each other's tails. The Crusaders outside the walls were not having a good time. They were being constantly harassed by Saladin's cavalry from behind while trying to maintain pressure on the city in front. Disease had swept through the camp. The winter of 1190 had been brutal. People were dying from starvation, dysentery, and sheer misery in roughly equal measure. The siege had become a slow death march that didn't seem to be going anywhere. Philip of France arrived first in April 1191 and immediately got sick, which was not an inspiring start. Then Richard arrived, also sick, because apparently the kings of medieval Europe had the immune systems of toddlers, but even sick, Richard's presence transformed the entire campaign. He brought money. He brought ships. He brought siege engines. He brought mangonels, massive catapult-like weapons, that he had specifically designed for this campaign. He brought an almost deranged tactical energy that electrified the demoralized Crusader army within hours of his arrival. Saladin, watching from the hills, received reports about the English king. He was cautious. He had defeated overconfident Crusaders before. But something about the descriptions of Richard, his speed of movement, his personal participation in battle, his ability to hold an army together through sheer personality, made Saladin pay attention in a way he hadn't needed to with other commanders. Within 5 weeks of Richard's arrival, Acre fell. The city's Muslim defenders, cut off from Saladin's relief forces, starving, exhausted, negotiated a surrender. They offered a ransom for the lives of the garrison, gold, the return of Christian prisoners, and the return of the true cross. Richard accepted the terms. Then came one of the ugliest moments of the entire campaign. The ransom payment fell behind schedule, a combination of logistical problems and what Richard interpreted as deliberate delay. Richard, facing a strategic situation that required him to move his army south toward Jerusalem without leaving a large garrison to guard thousands of prisoners, made a decision that has haunted his legacy ever since. He had approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners marched out of Acre and executed in full view of Saladin's army on the hills above. The reasons historians give for this vary. Some call it cold military calculation. He couldn't spare the men to guard them and couldn't afford to leave them behind. Some call it a rage response to perceived treachery. Some call it a war crime with no justification. What it definitely was is the moment that removed any remaining ambiguity about what this campaign was going to cost. Saladin watched from the hills, and the nature of this rivalry shifted. This was no longer just strategy. It was personal. Act 4. The March to Jerusalem. What Richard did next was, by the standards of medieval warfare, close to miraculous. He marched his army south along the coast toward Jerusalem. This sounds straightforward. It was not. Saladin's forces harassed them constantly, waves of horse archers riding at the flanks of the Crusader column, loosing arrows, attempting to provoke a charge that would break the formation and allow the cavalry to be surrounded and destroyed. The heat was punishing. The march stretched for days. Richard's solution was so disciplined it bordered on robotic. He organized the march into a tight column with the cavalry in the center, surrounded on the seaward side by the fleet, which supplied them with food and water, and on the landward side by infantry locked in shield formation. The knights were forbidden from charging no matter what. The horse archers could harass all they wanted. The column kept moving. It drove Saladin's commanders absolutely crazy. Here is where you begin to see the relationship between these two men take shape, not through meeting but through the exchange of tactics. Saladin would probe. Richard would adapt. Richard would push. Saladin would respond. It was less like two armies fighting and more like two chess grandmasters playing the same game from opposite ends of the board, each watching the other's moves with something between fury and admiration. The moment of crisis came at Arsuf, in September 1191. Saladin committed to a major assault on the marching column, hoping to break the formation and trigger a rout. His cavalry hit the rearguard, the Knights Hospitaller, who were taking devastating fire from horse archers and screaming at Richard for permission to charge. Richard kept saying no. The discipline held. The column kept moving. Then two knights in the rearguard broke formation and charged on their own. What followed is one of those rare moments in military history where the wrong decision turns out to be the right one entirely by accident. The two knights charged. The rest of the rearguard, unable to stop themselves, charged with them. The Crusader cavalry crashed into Saladin's forces like a battering ram, and the Muslim army, surprised by the sudden aggression, broke and retreated. Richard, furious and relieved in roughly equal measure, reformed his cavalry and charged a second time to exploit the opening. Arsuf was a Crusader victory. Saladin retreated in good order. He was too good a commander to turn a setback into a disaster, but it was the first time in years that a Crusader army had beaten his forces in open battle. He reportedly said afterward that if he were to lose his kingdom, he would rather lose it to Richard than to anyone else. That says something remarkable about the nature of this rivalry. These two men respected each other in a way that transcended the war they were fighting. Act 5. The Games Between Battles. And now we get to the strangest part of this story. While their armies were fighting each other, Richard and Saladin were also, in a completely medieval way, kind of corresponding. Not directly at first. Through intermediaries. Through Saladin's brother Aladil, who became an unlikely go-between. Through messages that mixed military negotiation with genuine curiosity about the man on the other side. Richard, at one point, proposed that his own sister Joan marry Aladil, with Jerusalem given to the couple as a wedding gift, allowing joint Christian-Muslim rule of the city. Saladin reportedly entertained this proposal with a straight face. Joan, informed of the plan, refused immediately. The proposal died. But the fact that it was made at all tells you something about the bizarre nature of this relationship. Saladin sent Richard fresh fruit and snow-cooled drinks when Richard fell ill during the campaign. This was not simple diplomatic gesture, it was genuine respect for an opponent. Richard, for his part, sent messages suggesting that Saladin was the greatest ruler in the Muslim world and that it was a tragedy they were enemies. These were not empty flattery. Richard was not a man who flattered people. He meant it. Meanwhile, and this is where we pause for a brief message from our sponsor. Real life has its own campaigns that require a different kind of strategic preparation. Act 6. Jaffa, Jerusalem, and the wall no one could climb. By the winter of 1191, Richard had his army at Beit Nuba, 12 miles from Jerusalem. 12 miles. He could see the hills on clear days. His army wanted to march. His knights wanted to charge. The holy city was right there. Richard didn't move. What followed is one of the most painful decisions of his career, and one of the most strategically sound. He had marched a long way from his supply base at Jaffa. His army was exhausted. It was winter, which meant his fleet couldn't reliably supply him. Jerusalem was a heavily fortified city on a hill. And Saladin, brilliant, patient, infuriating Saladin, had implemented a scorched earth policy around the city, poisoning wells, destroying crops, stripping the land of anything that could feed a besieging army. If Richard besieged Jerusalem and Saladin cut his supply lines, the Crusader army would be trapped on a hill with no food and no water. History had already shown at Hattin what that looked like. Richard withdrew to the coast. And then he did something tactical that was almost more impressive than any battle he had fought. He rebuilt the fortress of Ascalon, which Saladin had destroyed to prevent it being used as a Crusader base, stone by stone, personally helping carry materials to demonstrate to his army that this retreat was not defeat. It was preparation. This is the moment in the rivalry where Saladin's control over events becomes visible in a different way. He had not beaten Richard in the field. He couldn't really. Richard's army was too disciplined, too well supplied, too tactically sound. But he didn't need to. He was fighting a war of attrition, of supply lines, of political pressure. He knew that the crusading kings had finite time. Their kingdoms needed them. Their nobles were restless. They couldn't stay in the Middle East forever. Richard knew it too. The clock was ticking. In the summer of 1192, the Crusader army made a second approach to Jerusalem. They got to Beit Nuba again. The same 12 miles. The same view of the hills. And again, after weighing the tactical realities, Richard made the same decision. He could not besiege Jerusalem without risking everything. He withdrew a second time. It is the greatest non-event of the Third Crusade, and in some ways the greatest demonstration of Saladin's strategic genius. He never had to fight the battle for Jerusalem. He just had to make it impossible for Richard to fight it on good terms. What happened next almost broke Richard's campaign entirely. Saladin launched a devastating counterattack on Jaffa, the port city that was the Crusaders' main coastal base. His forces took most of the city in a sudden assault, trapping a small Crusader garrison in the citadel. Richard received the news by ship. He sailed directly to Jaffa, and what he did next is the kind of thing that gets passed down through centuries. He arrived to find Saladin's forces still in control of the city. His own troops were reluctant to row ashore because the beach was held by the enemy. So Richard, this is absolutely real, jumped off the ship into waist-deep water and waded ashore himself. By the time he reached the beach, half his army was jumping in behind him. They stormed the city. They retook it in hours. Saladin, receiving reports of this action, said something that has echoed through history: "A king does not risk himself like this." Then he launched a dawn attack on the Crusader camp outside Jaffa with overwhelming numbers, hoping to catch them unprepared. Richard, with perhaps 2,000 men against an army that significantly outnumbered him, formed his infantry into a wall of locked shields and kneeling spearmen and told his small number of cavalry to wait. Saladin's cavalry charged. The shields held. The cavalry broke against the wall. Richard's horsemen countercharged into the confusion. The Muslim army retreated. It was the last major engagement of the campaign. Both sides were exhausted. Both sides knew the war had reached a stalemate that neither could break. Act 7. The Treaty and the Parting. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The terms: the Crusaders would hold the coast, Jaffa, Acre, and a strip of the Mediterranean shore. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. Christians would be allowed to make peaceful pilgrimages to the Holy City and its sites. The true cross was not returned. The war was essentially a draw. Richard did not enter Jerusalem. He had come farther than any Crusader army in 2 decades. He had won every major engagement he fought. He had rebuilt the military credibility of the Crusader states from ruins. But he had not taken the city. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal, possibly true, that at one point during the campaign Richard climbed a hill and was shown a view of Jerusalem in the distance. He reportedly shielded his eyes and looked away, saying that he was not worthy to see what he could not take. Whether or not those were his exact words, the sentiment was real. He left the Holy Land in October 1192, never to return. Saladin died 5 months later, in March 1193 in Damascus. He was 54 years old. When the inventory of his possessions was taken, he had almost no money. He had given everything away, to the poor, to his soldiers, to the administration of his empire. He died essentially penniless by choice. His biographer wrote that when his funeral was held, the shroud used to cover his body had to be borrowed, because there was no money left to buy one. Act 8. The Legacy. Here is the irony at the heart of this story. Richard the Lionheart, who won nearly every battle he fought, is remembered in England as a romantic hero, and spent almost no time in England. He spoke French. He was, by modern standards, barely English at all. He returned from the Crusade, got captured by the Duke of Austria on his way home, held for ransom, released, fought more wars in France, and was killed in 1199 by an arrow at a minor siege over a disputed treasure. He was 41 years old. He never saw the Middle East again. Saladin, who technically lost the Third Crusade in the sense that he failed to expel the Crusaders from the coast, is remembered across the Arab world as one of the greatest leaders in Islamic history. A man who unified a fractured civilization, recaptured Jerusalem, defended it against the most powerful crusading force ever assembled, and did it all while refusing to massacre his enemies unnecessarily. Both men are remembered. That's the point. In a century full of forgotten kings and obliterated armies, these two, who never actually met face to face, who conducted their entire relationship through intermediaries in the language of battle, are as vivid today as they were in 1191. Because the greatest rivalries are never just about winning. They're about the way two extraordinary people bring out the absolute best in each other, even when they're trying to destroy everything the other has built. Richard was a better general because Saladin existed. Saladin was a better strategist because Richard forced him to be. The Third Crusade produced no clean victory, no decisive resolution. It produced something rarer, a confrontation between two genuine titans that ended in mutual respect and a stalemate that both men accepted as the best possible outcome given who they were fighting. History gave them to each other. And in the centuries since, it has refused to separate them. The lion and the sultan. The hammer and the chess master. Two men, one war, and a rivalry so perfectly constructed that it reads less like history and more like something a very talented novelist invented. Except it was real. Every blood-soaked, fruit-gifting, city-waiting, dawn-attacking moment of it. And that is the story of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the most legendary rivalry in the history of mankind.